On the opposite side of the lake, a cluster of houses had banded together to form what they proudly called an HOA. The officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, clearly expecting a routine disturbance call. Karen wasted no time approaching him, her voice sharp and filled with righteous indignation. She pointed at the photographs showing the cabin's mailbox, the dock, even the tenant's truck in the driveway. She twisted each detail into a narrative of disrespect, arguing that if one person could get away with ignoring HOA authority, then everyone would follow. He pulled property maps from the county clerk's office, highlighting the clear line where HOA jurisdiction ended. The lake cabin had always been a place of peace and retreat. It stood at the edge of the waterline, framed by tall pines and the shimmering reflection of the sun across the rippling surface. For years, it had been rented out to quiet tenants, who came seeking rest away from the busyness of the city. The cabin was small but comfortable, with a wraparound porch, a wood-burning fireplace, and an old but sturdy dock that stretched out into the calm lake waters. When the narrator, a seasoned property owner who had long since learned the delicate balance of managing rentals, checked in on the property, it appeared just as serene as always. The new tenant, a polite young man eager for a summer retreat, had moved in only a few weeks earlier. Everything seemed fine, until the whispers of a newly formed homeowners association began to reach his ears. On the opposite side of the lake, a cluster of houses had banded together to form what they proudly called an HOA. At the head of this group was a woman whose name quickly became synonymous with trouble: Karen. She was sharp, relentless, and obsessed with order. Her interpretation of community standards went far beyond what most would call reasonable. Lawn heights, mailbox designs, even the length of time someone's boat could be tied at the dock. Nothing escaped her watchful eye. The problem was, the narrator's lake cabin was never part of that association. It had stood there for decades, long before the development on the other side of the lake even existed. The land deeds were clear, and the property fell outside the HOA's jurisdiction. But Karen didn't see it that way. To her, the cabin was an uncooperative blot on her perfect neighborhood, and she made it her mission to bring it under her control. It started with letters. They were printed with the HOA letterhead and carried the tone of authority, demanding compliance with community guidelines. The narrator's tenant, confused and intimidated, passed them along to the landlord. At first, it was easy to dismiss. After all, the HOA had no legal standing over the property. But Karen didn't stop. She began showing up uninvited, walking onto the cabin's front porch and leaving notices taped to the door. She complained about the color of the cabin's shutters, about the dock not meeting HOA-approved safety standards, and about the tenant keeping a canoe tied up overnight. Each notice grew harsher, and her presence became more aggressive. For the narrator, this was nothing more than a nuisance at first, a meddlesome woman trying to throw her weight around where it didn't belong. But for the tenant, it was becoming unbearable. He had come to the cabin for peace, not confrontation, and now his summer retreat was being disrupted by constant harassment. Things came to a head one sunny afternoon when Karen, after yet another argument on the tenant's porch, declared that she would be calling the police. Her accusation was simple. The tenant was refusing to comply with HOA rules, and in her mind, that was a violation serious enough to warrant law enforcement involvement. The tenant called his landlord immediately, panicked and uncertain of what would happen next. For the narrator, this was the moment when nuisance turned into full-blown conflict. If Karen wanted to drag the situation into legal territory, then it was time to prepare for a confrontation she would not see coming. The stage was set for a battle between authority imagined and authority real, between a self-appointed enforcer of rules and the true owner of the land. Karen had made her move, but she had no idea whose property she was trespassing on, or whose patience she was about to test. And so, the calm of the lake began to crack, giving way to a storm that would soon sweep through the cabin, the community, and the HOA itself. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the lake as the sound of car tires crunching gravel broke the stillness. Karen had made good on her threat. A patrol car pulled up near the cabin, its flashing lights muted against the bright sky. The tenant stood nervously by the porch while Karen hovered close to the driveway, arms crossed, her expression triumphant. She had the look of someone who believed victory was already in her grasp. The officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, Clearly expecting a routine disturbance call, Karen wasted no time approaching him, her voice sharp and filled with righteous indignation. She gestured toward the cabin, pointing at the porch, the dock, even the mailbox at the end of the drive. She claimed the tenant was breaking community rules, that he had been warned multiple times, and that he was refusing to comply with the standards of the homeowners association. The officer scribbled notes while listening, his brow furrowed, trying to piece together what exactly the issue was. He looked toward the tenant, who stood quietly, then back at Karen, whose voice had grown louder, almost desperate in its need to be taken seriously. The officer's uncertainty was plain. This was hardly the kind of dispute most officers trained. For Dawa, the tenant explained in simple terms that he was renting the cabin, that he had followed every local law, and that the property was not part of the HOA. He pointed out that Karen had no authority over him, nor over the cabin. The officer nodded slowly, sensing that this was not the clear-cut violation Karen had painted it to be. But Karen was relentless, insisting that rules were rules, that everyone had to comply if the community was to remain orderly, and that his refusal was grounds for eviction. It was at this moment that the narrator, the true owner of the cabin, arrived. Having received the tenant's call earlier, he drove straight to the property, determined to put an end to the nonsense. As he walked up, Karen's demeanor shifted. For the first time, hesitation flickered across her face. She had assumed this was a tenant issue alone, a problem she could pressure into submission. She hadn't anticipated the landlord himself stepping into the picture. The narrator calmly introduced himself to the officer, presenting the property deed and documentation that clearly showed the cabin was outside the HOA's jurisdiction. The officer reviewed the papers carefully, his earlier uncertainty giving way to clarity. There was no violation of law here, no legal standing for Karen's demands. The officer's tone shifted, more official now, as he informed Karen that this was a civil matter at best, and that she had no right to enforce HOA rules on a property not under its governance. Karen's composure began to crack. Her face flushed as she tried to argue, but the officer's stance was firm. He had no authority to force the tenant to follow HOA rules that didn't apply, and Karen had no authority to claim otherwise. The law, at last, was spoken plainly, and it was not in her favor. Still, Karen refused to back down completely. She, warned that the HOA would escalate, that legal action would be taken, and that this would not be the end of it. The officer closed his notebook, signaling the conversation was over, and returned to his car. The flashing lights disappeared down the gravel road, leaving Karen fuming in the driveway. The narrator turned to face her, no anger in his expression, only resolve. He had tolerated her harassment long enough. Now it was clear. Karen was not just a nuisance. She was a threat to the peace of his property, his tenant, and the very principle of ownership. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly realize, was that she had already lost the battle she had started. Because while Karen believed she was fighting a tenant, she was, in fact, fighting her landlord. And the landlord held more than just property rights. He held leverage that Karen had no idea was about to come crashing down upon her. The lake was calm again, but only on the surface. Beneath it, the ripples of conflict were spreading, ready to erupt in ways Karen could never imagine. The following week, Karen shifted her strategy. The failed attempt with the police had bruised her pride, but it hadn't broken her determination. She returned to the HOA board with renewed fury, storming into their meeting with a stack of photographs, handwritten notes, and a voice full of righteous outrage. She painted the cabin and its tenant as a stain on the community, an act of defiance that threatened the very order she believed the HOA existed to protect. She pointed at the photographs, showing the cabin's mailbox, the dock, even the tenant's truck in the driveway. She twisted each detail into a narrative of disrespect, arguing that if one person could get away with ignoring HOA authority, then everyone would follow. Her words carried weight with some members, many of whom had grown accustomed to her leadership. Others, however, exchanged skeptical glances. They knew the cabin was outside HOA jurisdiction. They knew Karen was overstepping, but Karen's voice was relentless, silencing doubts with sheer force of personality. By the end of the meeting, she had secured a dangerous consensus. The HOA would pursue legal threats, letters of violation, and community pressure to force the cabin owner into submission. It didn't matter that the law wasn't on their side. In Karen's mind, pressure could break anyone, and the HOA was her hammer. Meanwhile, the narrator watched all of this unfold from a distance. He had contacts within the community, neighbors who respected him and quietly reported Karen's moves. Each step she took, he learned of it almost immediately. He wasn't rattled. In fact, he welcomed it. Every aggressive action from Karen only dug her deeper into the hole she couldn't climb out of. He began gathering his own documentation, not just property deeds, but rental agreements, maintenance records, and photographs of the tenants' compliance with local ordinances. He filed them neatly, preparing for the inevitable escalation. He knew HOA threats carried no legal authority here, but he also knew that exposing Karen's behavior required patience. She was setting the trap for herself, and he only needed to let her walk into it. The first letter arrived 2 days later. Bold print across the top read "Notice of Violation." It listed fabricated infractions: improper mailbox, unauthorized dock use, unapproved exterior paint color. The tenant, alarmed at first, handed the letter to the landlord, but the narrator only smiled. He recognized the bluff instantly. The HOA's jurisdiction line was drawn well before his cabin, and Karen had no authority to enforce anything beyond it. The letter was nothing but intimidation. Soon more letters followed, each more hostile than the last. Karen even circulated flyers around the neighborhood, framing the cabin as a threat to property values. She whispered rumors at community gatherings hinting that the tenant was untrustworthy and that the landlord was exploiting loopholes. Her campaign of pressure was in full force, but what Karen didn't anticipate was the quiet resistance forming around her. Neighbors who had long suffered under her rigid control began to see the cabin owner not as a threat, but as a symbol of defiance. Some even reached out to the landlord directly, offering support, sharing their own frustrations with Karen's leadership, and hinting at corruption within the HOA's finances. The landlord listened carefully, filing away each story, each shred of evidence. He realized this conflict was no longer just about a cabin or a mailbox. It was about an entire community living under the weight of Karen's authority. And now, the cracks were beginning to show. By the time Karen organized her next emergency HOA meeting to discuss the cabin, the landlord had already begun drafting his own plan. It wouldn't be loud or dramatic, at least not at first. It would be deliberate, precise, and devastating. Because if Karen wanted a war, she was about to learn what it felt like to fight someone who knew her weaknesses better than she knew her own. The lake remained calm, reflecting the blue of the summer sky. But beneath that calm, storms were gathering, and this time the landlord was ready to let them break. Karen's campaign reached a fever pitch. Flyers, letters, whispered gossip, and even surprise inspections, carried out by HOA members, she had pressured into compliance. Every week, the tenant found a new envelope taped to the cabin door, filled with warnings of fines and threats of eviction. Every week, Karen's voice grew louder at HOA meetings, insisting that action must be taken. But beneath the surface, something was unraveling. Her obsession with the cabin had begun to alienate her own allies. Neighbors who once admired her decisiveness now saw her as unhinged. Parents who used to bring their children to community barbecues stopped attending after Karen turned every gathering into a tirade against the cabin owner. Even members of the board started to question whether her personal vendetta was worth dragging the HOA's reputation through the mud. And still, Karen pressed on. The landlord, meanwhile, moved with quiet precision. He wasn't rattled by the noise, nor by the stack of bogus violation letters piling up on his tenant's kitchen table. He knew their legal weight was zero. Instead, he focused on strengthening his position. He pulled property maps from the county clerk's office, highlighting the clear line where HOA jurisdiction ended. He compiled receipts proving every tax bill had been paid, every permit in place. He gathered affidavits from neighbors who had endured Karen's intimidation tactics. He wasn't building a defense. He was building a weapon. The breaking point came one bright afternoon when Karen marched onto the cabin property with 2 other HOA board members in tow. They claimed they were there to inspect the mailbox and dock for compliance. The tenant, shaken, called the landlord immediately. The landlord drove down, calm but resolute. He found Karen on the dock, clipboard in hand, shouting about bylaws that didn't even apply to the property. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He only watched, taking in the scene, letting Karen's arrogance hang in the air for witnesses to see. Because the moment she stepped foot onto that dock, she had crossed from bluster into trespass. And that distinction would matter more than she realized. Later that week, the landlord quietly requested a meeting with the HOA board. Karen assumed it was a concession, that her pressure campaign was finally working. She arrived with smug satisfaction, ready to boast about her victory. But as the meeting began, the landlord revealed the first layer of his leverage. He produced the property deed, laying it flat on the table for all to see. He pointed to the boundary lines, clearly marked, showing the cabin outside of HOA territory. The room fell silent as the truth settled over them. Karen tried to protest, but the landlord wasn't finished. He reached into his folder again and placed another document on the table. This time, it was a rental agreement. The cabin wasn't just a property he owned, it was part of a larger parcel, including other rental units within the HOA's jurisdiction. And with that revelation, Karen's confident smile faltered, because the landlord wasn't just another property owner. He was one of the HOA's landlords. Several of its most vocal members were his tenants. The realization spread like wildfire through the boardroom. Karen had spent weeks harassing a man who quietly held authority over people sitting at the very table. Authority not rooted in bluster or bylaws, but in contracts, leases, and rent checks. Karen's voice trembled as she tried to regain control, but the power she once wielded was slipping fast. The board members who once backed her now shifted uncomfortably, realizing that siding with Karen could jeopardize their own homes. The whispers that followed were no longer about compliance, but about whether Karen had finally gone too far. The landlord said little else. He didn't need to. He gathered his documents, tucked them neatly back into his folder, and stood. As he left the room, Karen sat frozen, her face pale, her authority crumbling. For the first time, the community saw her, not as the iron-fisted leader she pretended to be, but as someone dangerously reckless, willing to drag them all into conflict without understanding the ground she was standing on. And the landlord knew. The next step would not just expose Karen's overreach. It would end her reign completely. The fallout from the landlord's quiet revelation rippled across the neighborhood like a storm. Within days of the board meeting, rumors spread that Karen had been publicly embarrassed. Neighbors who once cowered beneath her sharp words and endless demands now whispered openly about her humiliation. For the first time in years, she appeared vulnerable. But Karen was not the kind to retreat quietly. Embarrassment only stoked her fury. She doubled down, determined to claw back her authority. New notices appeared around the community bulletin. Boards claiming that rogue property owners threatened the harmony of the neighborhood. At the top of her list was the cabin, plastered with warnings of pending litigation. She began showing up at her tenants' homes, knocking on doors unannounced, reminding them that she was the authority and that siding with the landlord would be a mistake. But her tactics no longer carried the weight they once did. The tenants remembered who signed their leases and who maintained their homes. Her voice might fill the streets with noise, but the landlord's pen could change lives. Her last card was escalation. Karen called in outside help, code enforcement officers, police patrols, even a lawyer she had used before in small disputes. She demanded that the city fine the landlord for supposed violations. She insisted that the police remove the tenant from the cabin for refusing to comply with HOA orders. But each attempt ended the same way: dismissed, ignored, or laughed off. Because the evidence was clear, the HOA had no jurisdiction. The community began to fracture around her. Board members resigned quietly, unwilling to continue under her leadership. Others began whispering about petitions to remove her. For years, Karen had ruled by intimidation, but now the same voices she silenced found courage in her weakness. The balance of power had shifted, and she didn't know how to stop it. Meanwhile, the landlord was deliberate and patient. He knew Karen's desperation would push her into reckless moves, and every reckless move made his case stronger. He compiled her flyers, her threats, her attempts to trespass, her baseless calls to authorities. Piece by piece, he was assembling not just a defense, but an undeniable record of harassment. When the petition to remove Karen finally began circulating, the landlord stayed in the background. He didn't need to lead the charge. His neighbors, once too fearful to oppose her, were now emboldened. With each signature added, Karen's empire shrank. But she wasn't finished. She still had one more move left, one last dramatic stand, that she believed would restore her crown. And that move would be the one to end her for good. It came on a Saturday morning, when the lake community gathered for what Karen had billed as an emergency HOA meeting. Flyers had been shoved into mailboxes, bold letters claiming that the neighborhood's future was at stake. She had pulled every string she could, hoping to rally supporters, to prove she still held the reins. The landlord attended quietly, sitting near the back. He didn't need to speak. He only needed to watch. Karen stood at the front of the clubhouse, her voice sharp and defiant. She railed against the lawless property owner who refused to comply. She warned of collapsing property values, of outsiders destroying their community. She tried to paint herself as the last line of defense, the guardian of order. But the faces staring back at her were not filled with loyalty. They were tired, skeptical, even angry. Many had grown weary of the constant drama. Others had felt the sting of her overreach firsthand. And in the back of the room, the landlord held the thick folder that contained everything. Proof that Karen had harassed, trespassed, and lied. When Karen finally turned her fury toward him, pointing across the room and shouting about his refusal to obey the rules, the landlord rose. Calmly, without raising his voice, he opened the folder and handed the contents to the city liaison attending the meeting, a neutral observer who had been invited weeks earlier by residents concerned about Karen's leadership. The room fell into silence as the documents were read aloud. Property maps proving the cabin was outside HOA jurisdiction. Copies of Karen's threatening letters and illegal violation notices. Witness statements describing her harassment. Even police reports documenting her repeated attempts to misuse law enforcement. One by one, her actions were laid bare, each piece stripping away the facade she had built for years. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Former allies lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet her gaze. And then, the city liaison delivered the final blow. Karen had not only overstepped her authority, she had broken laws. Trespassing, harassment, abuse of position. Her voice cracked as she tried to protest. But the weight of the evidence drowned her out. The community no longer listened. The petition for her removal was presented, signatures filling the page. It passed without resistance. Karen was ousted on the spot, stripped of her title, her power, and her platform. The landlord didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He had never sought power in the first place, only peace. But peace had come at a price for Karen. For years, she believed fear made her untouchable. But when fear gave way to truth, her empire crumbled. Weeks later, the neighborhood looked different. Meetings became calmer. Rules were enforced with fairness, not weaponized for control. The cabin stood quietly by the lake, unchanged, untouched, a symbol of resistance that had toppled a reign of intimidation. As for Karen, she faded into the background. The same neighbors who once nodded politely when she passed now avoided her gaze. Her voice, once booming across the community, was reduced to whispers behind closed doors. The irony was cruel, but fitting. She had called the cops to prove her dominance, to crush someone she believed beneath her. Instead, she had been crushed by the one truth she never imagined. Her supposed enemy was the landlord of the very community she tried to rule. And with that, her story ended. Not in triumph, but in silence. The lake was peaceful again.